In 1995, therapist John Paul, Chief Lilly, faced a problem therapy alone couldn't solve. An abused 8-year-old named Alex was too terrified to leave his home. Chief called 27 bikers to show the boy he wasn't alone. That ride became Bikers Against Child Abuse, growing from one child and a handful of riders into an international nonprofit with thousands of members and chapters across nearly 20 countries. This is the full story of how bikers turned fear into protection and built a global movement around showing up. Part 1. The Therapist Who Got Angry. Here's something that surprises almost everyone when they first hear the story. BACA wasn't created by a gang. It didn't come from a motorcycle club looking for a charitable cause. It started with a therapist. His name was John Paul Lilly, although most people knew him simply as Chief. On paper, he didn't fit the image of leather, motorcycles, and biker clubs at all. He was a licensed clinical social worker, a registered play therapist, and even taught part-time at Brigham Young University. For more than 2 decades, his work centered on one difficult job: helping young children who had suffered physical or sexual abuse. Some of those children were only 3 years old. If you've never sat across from a 5-year-old who flinches when you move your hand too quickly, it's difficult to understand what that kind of work can do to someone over 20 years. Chief watched children make small but incredibly important breakthroughs in his office. A child who hadn't spoken during the first 6 sessions might suddenly put together a complete sentence. A child who refused to make eye contact might finally laugh. Those moments were real progress, real signs that a child was beginning to heal. But then the therapy session ended, the child went home. And sometimes that meant returning to the same house, the same street, or the same neighborhood where the person who had hurt them was still nearby. Custody cases can drag on, courts can move slowly, and being removed from immediate danger doesn't always mean a child is completely safe. Then Chief would see the child again the following week, and sometimes that progress was simply gone. A car moving slowly past the house could trigger the fear again. A knock at the door could bring back memories the child had been trying to escape. Over time, Chief began seeing what he believed was a major weakness in the child protection system. Therapy could help repair what was happening inside a child, but who was protecting the child outside the therapist's office? Who was standing in the yard? Who was making sure that child felt safe between appointments? During the hours and days when the fear was still very real, Chief became frustrated with that gap. And eventually, that frustration turned into action. Part 2. Alex. Every origin story has a moment that changes everything. For BACA, that moment had a name: Alex. Alex was 8 years old and one of Chief's patients. He had survived abuse so severe that he had almost completely stopped leaving his home. It wasn't simply that he didn't want to go outside. He couldn't. The world beyond his front door had become too frightening for him. Technically, he was receiving therapy. But there was a bigger problem. A child who was too terrified to even step outside his own house was facing a barrier that therapy alone couldn't easily overcome. He needed to feel safe enough to leave the front door before he could begin experiencing the world differently. And that was the problem Chief was trying to solve. Chief did something that, by his own account, went against the normal rules of his profession. He didn't keep Alex's treatment confined to an office or a therapy session. Instead, he brought the boy into a part of his own life, the biker world he'd known since childhood. For Chief, motorcycles had always meant something bigger than machines. They represented freedom, strength, and the feeling that you had people around you who would stand behind you when things got difficult. So, in 1995, Chief reached out to the people he knew: friends, fellow riders, members of his biker circle. Among them were Horace Montoya and Mark Ogre Burchett, 2 men who would eventually play important roles in building the organization that followed. The idea was remarkably simple: bring a group of bikers to Alex's neighborhood. Let this frightened child see, up close, that there were big, intimidating people who weren't there to hurt him. They were there because they had decided to stand on his side. 27 bikers showed up for that first ride. 27. On paper, that's not a huge crowd. But imagine being 8 years old, and living with fear for so long that simply leaving your own home feels impossible. Then, one day, 27 bikers arrive on roaring motorcycles because they heard you were afraid and decided they weren't going to let you face that fear alone. For a child in that situation, 27 people can feel like an entire army. And it worked. News of what happened with Alec began spreading through biker communities the way stories usually travel in close-knit groups, person to person. There was no major advertising campaign. People simply told other riders what had happened. You need to hear about this. Before long, new chapters began appearing, first in Utah, then in other states, and eventually, the idea crossed international borders. Over the following decades, BACA grew into an international non-profit organization, with chapters not only throughout the United States, but also in countries including Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, along with more than a dozen other countries. At various points, the organization grew to nearly 2,000 members. Think about how far that had come. One traumatized 8-year-old, 27 bikers, and an idea built around one simple principle. Don't just tell a frightened child they're safe. Keep showing up until they believe it. Part 3. How it actually works. Now this is where a lot of people misunderstand BACA. The image is powerful. Large motorcycles, leather vests, and bikers who can look intimidating at first glance. So it's easy to imagine something completely different. Some kind of vigilante group riding into neighborhoods to confront abusers directly. Maybe even something resembling a motorcycle militia. But that's not how BACA operates. And the reality is actually more interesting, because underneath the bikes and the tough appearance is an organization built around procedure, restraint, and a surprisingly careful understanding of how trauma and fear affect children. It usually begins with a referral. A parent, guardian, caseworker, and sometimes even a school counselor contacts a local BACA chapter because a child is dealing with serious, ongoing fear. We're not talking about ordinary sadness. This is a deep, disabling fear connected to an abuse situation that has already been reported to the proper authorities. And that distinction is important. BACA doesn't investigate abuse cases on its own. They don't operate outside the legal system or try to replace the police, child protective services, or the courts. They step in after the abuse has already been reported. Their role is different. It's about filling the spaces where law enforcement and the legal system simply can't be present every hour of every day. A chapter liaison then speaks with the family and, when appropriate, talks with the child. The goal is to understand what's happening and make sure the fear is genuine, specific, and something BACA's involvement can actually help address. Then comes the first ride. Members from the local chapter, and sometimes riders from nearby chapters as well, because word can spread quickly through the biker community. Ride out to meet the child. Usually, they go to the child's home or another place where the child already feels comfortable. What happens next is part ceremony, part emotional welcome, and part superhero-style introduction. The child receives a small vest of their own, modeled after the vests worn by BACA members, with a BACA patch sewn onto the back. Then comes the teddy bear. It's not simply a toy handed over to the child. The bear is passed around among the members first, with each person giving it a hug. By the time it reaches the child, the group describes it as being loaded with everyone's hugs. And if that bear ever feels empty again, if the child becomes frightened and needs another reminder that people are standing with them, they can make a phone call. The members come back and refill it with hugs. The child can also choose a road name. It's not their real name. It's a nickname, similar to the names many adult members use within the biker community. You might hear names like Reaper, Casper, Ogre, Nugget, Tink, Baby Girl, or Rags. Members generally don't use their legal names inside the group, and when the child chooses a road name and sees it stitched or written onto that little vest, something important has changed. They're no longer being treated simply as a case file. They're being welcomed into a family. They're being given an identity within the group, much like an adult member who has earned their patch. But there's one part of this process that matters more than all the ceremony. The child isn't forced to do any of it. They can wear the vest, or they can leave it hanging in the closet. They can choose a road name, or they can decide they don't want one. The decision stays with the child. And that matters, because abuse can leave a child feeling like they've lost control over their own life, their own choices, and even their own body. Baka's rituals are designed, whether members describe them in those exact terms or not, to give some of that control back. After the first meeting, the child is given the names and phone numbers of 2 Baka members who live closest to them. Those 2 members become the child's primary points of contact. Instead of handing over one general chapter number and making the relationship feel like an organization or an institution, the child has 2 specific people they know they can reach. 2 familiar voices. 2 people who are close by. 2 people who are there when the fear comes back. Part 4. When things escalate. For many children, that first ride changes everything. The vest, the teddy bear, the sight of an entire group of bikers suddenly standing in their corner can make the world feel a little less frightening. But it doesn't always solve everything. Sometimes, the fear is much more specific. Maybe the person who abused the child has been driving past the house. Maybe there's an upcoming court hearing, and the child is terrified of seeing that person again. That's when Baka can move into what members describe as different levels of intervention. A level 1 response might simply involve several members standing outside the child's home for a period of time. They're there as a visible reminder that someone is watching and that the child isn't facing the situation alone. If that's not enough, if the child's fear is more severe or there's a specific and credible threat, a level 2 response can involve calling on a much larger part of the Baka network. That group can sometimes grow to dozens of riders. They can form a visible presence around the home, creating a human perimeter and remaining there for as long as necessary to help the child feel safe again. There's even a documented case involving a chapter that stayed outside a child's home for 16 straight days. The child had become terrified after repeatedly seeing the person who had abused them driving past the house. 16 days. Members worked in shifts, sleeping in relays and taking turns staying on watch. The goal was simple. Whenever that child looked out the window, day or night, there would be someone there who cared enough to stay. And then there's court. If you've never stopped to think about what it must feel like for a child to testify against the person who abused them, imagine it for a moment. Courtrooms aren't designed with children in mind. They're formal. They're intimidating. They're filled with legal language that a 10-year-old may barely understand. And sometimes the hardest part is knowing that the child may have to sit in the same room as the person who hurt them, possibly for the first time since the abuse occurred. Baka members can attend those hearings. They may fill seats in the gallery, sit as close to the child as courtroom rules allow, and accompany them as they enter and leave the building. For a frightened child, seeing a group of protective adults standing nearby, people who showed up simply because they wanted to support them, can make an enormous difference. It can mean the difference between fear taking over completely and a child finding enough courage to get through the testimony. Part 5. The patch means something. In biker culture, a patch is never just decoration. Anyone familiar with motorcycle clubs knows that a patch represents something. It's earned. It carries identity, loyalty, and belonging. And in some parts of biker culture, wearing a patch you haven't earned can bring serious consequences. Baka took that same meaning and gave it a completely different purpose. Their patch wasn't designed just to look intimidating. Every color and symbol was meant to represent something connected to the organization's mission. White represents the innocence of the children Baka is trying to protect. Black represents the darkness those children have already been forced to experience. Red represents blood, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, tied to the trauma of abuse, and the difficult legal battles that can follow. The skulls represent the death of child abuse itself. That's the enemy Baka exists to fight. The fist represents the willingness to stand up and fight for that mission. And the chains represent a promise. The children Baka takes in shouldn't remain trapped by what happened to them. For Baka members, those symbols aren't taken lightly. When a member retires or leaves the organization, their patch is reportedly burned. It's not put away in a drawer. It's not handed to someone else. It's destroyed. The reason is straightforward. Nobody should be able to take that old patch, put it on, and pretend to be an active Baka member. And for an organization dealing with frightened children and vulnerable families, that matters. Trust is everything. If parents are going to allow Baka members into their children's lives, they need to know exactly who they're dealing with. Destroying old patches is one small part of protecting that trust. But there's another misconception worth clearing up. When people first hear about Baka, some assume it's made up of outlaw motorcycle club members who simply decided to take up child advocacy on the side. That's generally not the case. Baka members come from all kinds of backgrounds: truck drivers, mechanics, nurses, veterans, IT workers, warehouse supervisors, and plenty of other people who ride motorcycles and decided they wanted to help. They may look intimidating from the outside, but looking tough isn't enough to become part of Baka. Before members are allowed to have contact with children, chapters conduct background checks on prospective members. They also have access to licensed mental health professionals who provide training on childhood trauma, the psychological effects of abuse, and how members should and shouldn't interact with children who have experienced it. So this isn't simply a group of tough-looking bikers showing up and figuring things out as they go. There's a structure behind it. There's screening, there's training, and there's a system built around putting the child's safety first. The unusual part is simply the way that system is delivered. Instead of operating through a traditional corporate-style organization, Baka built its structure around motorcycle culture, taking the same symbols of brotherhood, loyalty, and strength, and turning them toward one purpose: making abused children feel safe again. Part 6. Why it actually works. The psychology behind it. This is probably one of the most important parts of the Baka story, and it's also one of the easiest to overlook, because what Baka does isn't simply a feel-good gesture involving motorcycles and teddy bears. There's a deeper psychological reason behind why the approach can matter, even if the people who created Baka weren't using clinical language to explain it when they first started. Trauma researchers have long pointed to one of the most damaging effects of ongoing abuse. A child can lose their sense of control. The world becomes unpredictable. Things that should feel normal suddenly don't. And eventually, a child can start believing that nothing they do will actually keep them safe. Recovering from that kind of trauma isn't just about talking through what happened. It's also about helping the child feel safe again in the real world, inside their home, around their neighborhood, and during the ordinary parts of everyday life. A therapist can do important work inside an office, but if the child walks out of that office and returns to a place that still feels dangerous, it's difficult for them to fully believe that anything has changed. And that's where Baka's approach becomes especially interesting. They create something the child can actually see, not just reassurance, not just someone saying, "You're safe now," but visible proof that people are willing to stand behind those words. For a frightened child, that can mean everything. Instead of simply hearing that someone cares, they can look around and see people who deliberately chose to come there for them. The Baka patch becomes something physical, something the child can see and hold on to when the fear comes back. Then there's the teddy bear. It's not just a stuffed animal. After being passed around and hugged by Baka members, the bear becomes a physical reminder that an entire group of people is standing with that child. When the memories return at night, when the fear creeps back in, the child has something tangible to hold. And then there's perhaps the most important part of all: choice. The child can decide whether they want to wear the vest, They can choose a road name. They can decide they don't want one. They can choose how much they want to participate. From the outside, those might seem like small decisions. For a child who has experienced abuse, they're anything but small. Abuse can leave a child feeling as though control over their own life and body was taken away from them. So giving that child choices, even simple ones, can help return a little of that control. There's another fascinating part of Baca's approach, and it comes from the image itself. Most people are naturally a little cautious when they see a group of large, tattooed bikers wearing leather and standing around motorcycles. That's exactly what makes the image so powerful for some of these children. The same toughness that might make an adult nervous can become incredibly reassuring when a child realizes those people aren't there to frighten them. They're there to stand between the child and the danger. The intimidation is no longer aimed at the child. It's pointed in the opposite direction. One Baca member explained why he became involved after spending years burying teenagers who had lost their own battles with despair. His explanation was remarkably simple. Watching a frightened child meet the group and seeing that genuine light come back into their eyes is something that's difficult to put into words. And that's how many Baca members describe the experience. Not simply as charity, not as doing something nice for a child, but as watching something inside that child begin to come alive again. A child who had started believing that something inside them was permanently broken suddenly gets a reason to believe otherwise. Almost like a switch that had been turned off for years suddenly comes back on. Part 7. A family, not a charity case. One thing becomes clear when you listen to families who have been involved with Baca. The organization makes a deliberate effort not to treat children like helpless victims waiting to be rescued. Instead, everything revolves around one word: adopted. These children aren't treated like clients. They aren't reduced to case numbers. They're treated like family. And that's more than a feel-good phrase. It changes the relationship from the very beginning. Take the story that has been publicly shared about Vanessa and her 9-year-old son, who was formally welcomed by a Baca chapter in Australia. 3 different chapters rode out to the family's home in the Hunter region and spent time with them in their backyard. This wasn't a quick stop for a few photographs. They didn't arrive, take pictures, and disappear down the road. They stayed. They spent genuine time with the family, treating one child's safety and peace of mind as something worth giving an entire afternoon to. And that's the part that surprises people. Baca isn't supposed to be about making one dramatic appearance and then moving on. Once a child is adopted, the relationship with the 2 members closest to them can continue for years. Sometimes, that connection lasts well into adulthood, because the relationship isn't supposed to disappear once the immediate danger is gone. It's about the child, not just the crisis. And Baca extends that same idea to brothers and sisters. If one child in a family has experienced abuse, the organization generally works to include the siblings too. The goal is to make sure one child doesn't feel singled out or separated from everyone else in the family. Everyone can have a vest. Everyone can choose a road name. And nobody has to grow up carrying the feeling that they're simply the one it happened to. Part 8. The founder's final chapter. Every organization eventually has to face the loss of the person who started it. For Baca, that moment came in the summer of 2024, when John Paul Chief Lilly died suddenly following a medical event. To the people who knew him, Chief was more than the founder of an organization. Friends remembered him as a devoted husband, a father, and a man whose life's work was centered around helping children recover from experiences that had caused them enormous pain. After his death, his wife, Lisa, spoke publicly about what had pushed Chief to create Baca in the first place. And the reason was surprisingly simple. He had grown tired of watching children make progress in therapy, only to see that progress disappear when they returned to an environment where they still didn't feel safe. Chief wanted to close that gap. He wanted protective people physically present in the neighborhoods where these children actually lived. Not just a therapist sitting across from them once a week. He wanted people who would show up. people the child would recognize. People who could help turn the idea of safety into something the child could actually feel outside the therapy room. By the time Chief died, the organization that began with 27 bikers and one frightened 8-year-old had grown into an international movement, with chapters across nearly 20 countries and thousands of members. Think about that for a moment. The entire thing started with one social worker, one child who was too afraid to leave his own home, and a group of bikers who decided to show up. The organization continued after Chief's death, carried forward by the chapters and leadership structure he had spent more than 3 decades helping build. And in some ways, that may be one of the clearest signs that his original idea worked. Baka was never meant to depend on one man forever. It was built to become something larger than its founder, a community, a network, a family. A family big enough to keep showing up, even after the man who started the ride was no longer there to lead it. Part 9. The honest questions people ask. If you're watching the Baka story and thinking, hold on, how does all of this actually work? That's a completely fair question. Because let's be honest, when a group of large, tattooed bikers starts becoming involved in the lives of vulnerable children, people are naturally going to ask who these people are, what they're allowed to do, and what safeguards are in place. Those questions deserve real answers. Baka's process starts with screening. Background checks are a standard part of bringing new members into the organization before they're allowed to have contact with children. Members also operate under chapter leadership and receive guidance and training from licensed mental health professionals. But perhaps the most important point is what Baka doesn't do. They're not a replacement for the police. They're not child protective services. And they're not supposed to become their own private justice system. Baka doesn't investigate abuse allegations themselves. They don't confront alleged abusers. And they don't decide whether someone's guilty or innocent. Their involvement comes after an abuse situation has already been reported through the appropriate authorities. Their job is different. They're there to provide something the legal system can't always provide around the clock: support, reassurance, and a visible sense of safety for the child. But there's another part of the conversation that's worth being honest about. Baka is a large volunteer organization made up of local chapters, and that means things can vary from one location to another. Training, procedures, and vetting may differ somewhat, depending on the chapter and the country where it's operating. That's partly because Baka didn't grow like a traditional corporation, with every location controlled from one central office. It grew organically, chapter by chapter, community by community. People heard about the mission, believed in it, and decided they wanted to become involved. And that kind of grassroots growth brings challenges. Baka isn't unique in that regard. Large volunteer and nonprofit organizations operating across different communities often have to deal with the same issue. What matters is that Baka's public materials place strong emphasis on background checks and mental health oversight. And there's a very good reason for that. The entire relationship is built on trust. Parents have to trust the members around their children. Children have to feel safe in their presence. And Baka has to make sure that the people wearing its patch are worthy of that trust. For this organization, that's not some minor administrative detail. It's the foundation everything else depends on. Part 10. Why this story matters right now. This is where the Baka story becomes bigger than motorcycles. Child abuse remains a massive problem, with millions of reports investigated every year in the United States alone. But behind every statistic is a real child, a real home, a real neighborhood, and sometimes a child lying awake at 2 in the morning, wondering whether the person who hurt them is going to come back. The systems created to protect those children do important work. Police investigate, caseworkers respond, social workers provide treatment, courts make decisions. But none of those systems were designed to physically stand beside a child every hour of every day. A caseworker can't sit outside a house at midnight. A judge can't walk a frightened child into a courtroom. and a therapist can't be there every time a child hears a strange car slow down outside their window. That's the gap Baca was created to address. It started, almost by accident, with one biker and one terrified 8-year-old named Alec. And what Chief Lilly discovered was that sometimes protection isn't only about having the right system in place. Sometimes it's about being there. There's a huge difference between telling a frightened child you're safe and actually showing up at their door. Imagine being that child. You're already afraid of the world. Then, one day, you hear motorcycles. You look outside, and there are dozens of bikers standing there because they heard you were scared and decided they weren't going to leave you facing that fear alone. That's the idea at the heart of Baca. And there's something almost unexpected about the way it came together. For decades, society has often looked at big, loud, tattooed bikers and instinctively kept its distance. Baca took that exact image and turned it completely around. The leather, the motorcycles, the size, the toughness. Instead of using those things to intimidate people, Baca uses them to make vulnerable children feel protected. The same person who might make an adult nervous can become the person a frightened child is happiest to see pulling up outside the house. And that's what makes Bikers Against Child Abuse such an unusual story. They took an image people associated with fear and turned it into a symbol of safety.